November 8th, 2018, the digital online streaming service Disney Plus was revealed to the public. The new platform's intent was to house all Disney properties from television and cinema from the over 100 years since the company's inception, meaning that for the first time ever, long-lost pieces of media, animated or otherwise, may make their way onto this premium subscription feed. Disney is notorious for locking pieces of its history that shine a not-so-glamorous light onto their brand or simply outstate their welcome in the eyes of audiences behind the infamous Disney Vault, never to be seen again. But with the promise of featuring not only a variety of new shows, but the majority of their backlog that hasn't been broadcast to a wider market since first making its way onto our screens, Disney Plus seemed sure to feature one or the other interesting surprise. With the hype surrounding it, however, skeptics were quick to question the practicability of the site. As the biggest one of its kind, and with a backlog such as Disney's, a few bad apples could potentially sour the Disney brand as much as they used to when the company refused to air movies like Song of the South, being one of the more prominent examples of Disney's concerning past with their depiction of minorities. While a compromise was reached with some of the other properties featured, like the 1941 animated movie Dumbo, where a disclaimer was added warning audiences of the quote outdated cultural depictions and that the program would be presented as originally created, films like Song of the South remain unseen. Trying to distance themselves from instances like these isn't the only reason Disney chose to omit some media from the platform, however, as licensing issues, such as the case with the Indiana Jones movies, prevented them from hosting this line of films on the service from day one. In other instances, however, the decision against a spot on Disney Plus was seemingly random, as shows such as the crime investigation series Fillmore was nowhere to be seen, and as no further explanation was given as to why it wasn't featured on the site, a growing concern was starting to spread that Disney Plus wasn't going to be as all-encompassing a hub for this massive backlog of content as we had hoped, and instead only going to be going the route of other streaming services of its kind with periodical additions that would eventually replace worst-performing content. The months after the announcement of Disney Plus were filled with heavy speculation on what shows and films would be included, and as at that point, it wasn't entirely clear what Disney was implying with their promise of featuring their entire catalog. Until on September 12, 2019, a free trial of the service was launched in the Netherlands, with limited content available, as is common practice to test servers of its kind and make sure things would be running smoothly at launch, which finally granted us access to the full selection of shows that were to be featured on Disney Plus. And while the amount of pleasant surprises was something of a treasure hunt in and of itself, with the official Twitter account posting a whole thread of the shows and movies to be featured, it was one show from the Disney Afternoon lineup in particular that stood out from the rest. While the Disney Afternoon block was hailed for its great selection of unique and fun animated programming, Disney's Bonkers had not been granted any of the same attention dedicated to it than the block's other shows like Darkwing Duck and The Gummy Bears, which have since even been featured in the widely acclaimed DuckTales reboot, while the last sighting of any Bonkers-related piece of media was when the show made its way onto Toon Disney until late 2004, when Disney abandoned the character entirely. Although it's easy to assume this was simply because the show hadn't garnered as big a following due to a short run, it was still a frontrunner for the Disney Afternoon block at the time of its broadcast in the mid-90s, has 3 video games to its name, and even made appearances in Disney's amusement parks. While never on the same level of adoration as many of its contemporaries, even shows with a far shorter life cycle from the time would go on to garner some sort of cult status, while Bonkers' appearances in other Disney-related media was severely limited. And even though one of the aforementioned video games was developed by acclaimed publisher Capcom, who was responsible for the critically appraised Aladdin and DuckTales NES and SNES adaptations among others, Bonkers' game never made its way onto the official Disney Afternoon game collection in 2017, further proving how much Disney tried to erase all public conscious of the character. But what was it about this simple orange-furred bobcat that made Disney want to distance itself from it for so long? And what reason could there be for its sudden return?
Know me? Show the cartoon!
But you said to never show that cartoon.
Show it!
It's no secret that Disney from the early to mid 80s didn't have nearly as strong a hold on the animated market as it used to, with films like The Black Cauldron often being cited as some of the worst decisions and wastes of money the company had made, and the TV market was no different, due to Walt Disney's personal bias against the medium, and since he didn't consider it commercially viable. Up until 1984, Disney didn't have a single in-house animated show to its name. When the Paramount Pictures executive Michael Eisner stepped onto the scene, however, he was quick to restructure the entirety of their animation department and founded an entire animation division solely for television that was assigned to produce a number of original animated series, a number of which would air on the new 2-hour block known as the Disney Afternoon. Between 1985 and 91, the network would produce a number of animated series that were each unique in their own right, but were also cut from the same cloth, with their titular characters taking center stage in similar settings, leading many to believe all these shows might take place within the same universe. As the early 90s came around, however, Eisner had purchased the rights to the Belgian comic strip Marsupilami, and was looking for a way to introduce the character to American audiences. And although the character would eventually star in a series of its own, Eisner decided against adding a full Marsupilami show to the Disney Afternoon lineup, opting instead to go for an animated rendition of the sketch comedy format popularized by Saturday Night Live, with a different Disney character taking on the role of the host every new episode, telling both an original storyline of theirs and splicing Marsupilami shorts in between, an approach they would eventually revisit in 2001 with the Saturday morning show House of Mouse. It was decided then that Marsupilami wouldn't be the only character whose shorts would be featured on this new show, Raw Toonage, as Disney had previously created the aforementioned Bonkers D. Bobcat character, whose own show was to premiere a year after the first episode of Raw Toonage, alongside the first episode of the Marsupilami show. While it is unknown who it was that came up with the character itself, his inception was a story that was very true to the name of the character. Years before Disney had any plans to venture out into the TV market, the then CEO of the company, Ron W. Miller, purchased the rights to the American mystery novel Who Censored Roger Rabbit, about an LA-based private detective living side by side with cartoon characters, but sees himself forced to work with them to solve crimes, with which some alterations was adapted into the 1988 live-action 2D hybrid movie Who Framed Roger Rabbit. It was hailed at the time for its seamless integration of 2D animated segments into the streets of LA, an accurate depiction of 40s Hollywood, and uniting cartoon characters from various studios on the big screen. And while it certainly helped adding to the film's charm and believability to see Warner-owned characters like Daffy Duck interact on screen together with Disney-owned ones like Donald Duck, this mixing and mangling of characters from different studios resulted in issues distributing the film onto platforms like Disney+. What didn't help was that the film's producer, Steven Spielberg, did not feel then Disney CEO Michael Eisner was acting animously to Spielberg's friend and business partner Jeffrey Katzenberg, who would go on to found DreamWorks Pictures together with Spielberg, resulting in a split between Spielberg and Eisner that prevented Disney from pursuing any future Roger Rabbit projects and ultimately losing the rights to the character. While a sequel to the film was supposedly still in the works in the early 2000s with a mix of CGI and traditional 2D animation, the company felt an already inflated budget was not worth the legal headaches surrounding the character, as producer Don Hahn felt a sequel wouldn't have that special edge to it as the original had in the 90s, where, quote, there was something very special about that time when animation was not as much in the forefront as it is now. Eisner, however, knew he needed to capitalize on the concept of the world Roger Rabbit takes place in, even if his hands were tied in regards to the character itself. Development began on a series that was heavily inspired by the world of Who Framed Roger Rabbit. With elements to it so similar, the new show was different in almost nothing but its name. Toon Cop would be a show centered around Bonkers, an anthropomorphic bobcat and cartoon star. After his in-universe show got cancelled, he is forced to team up with a disgruntled human detective with a distaste for cartoon characters to solve crimes. Sound familiar? To grant further insight into the matter, Gargoyle's creator and co-director on the show Greg Weisman stated that Roger certainly provided inspiration for Bonkers. I suppose one could say that if some higher up came up to us and said, "Do you want to do the TV version of Roger Rabbit?" which never happened, then we would have jumped at the chance, and most likely Bonkers never would have happened. But that Toon Cop itself, which would later be renamed to He's Bonkers the Bobcat, was never planned to center on the character of Roger Rabbit. Regardless of the intentions behind the making of Bonkers, as it would ultimately be called, the show is going to join the lineup of shows after audiences got introduced to its protagonist through the Raw Toonage shorts, which took place before his in-universe show got cancelled. And though the inception of the concept behind Bonkers makes most sense when you consider the context of its release, right at the height of Roger Rabbit's popularity, there's far more to the story than meets the eye, as this basic premise of the show was not actually the first iteration of the character, and was born out of complete necessity. Looking at the footage on screen, you might have noticed the design of Bonkers slightly altering between shots, with him sometimes sporting a far droopier antennae and altering between 1 and 2 dots on each of his whiskers. And what is up with that female detective that's on screen a few times? She wasn't in the Roger Rabbit movie. That's because even though elements of Roger Rabbit already made their way into the first depiction of the series, it was actually forced into a soft reboot before even a single episode made it onto the air. While the Raw Toonage shorts were in production, there were 65 episodes ordered for the new Bonkers solo cartoon, as that is the standard for syndicated programs of its kind. It was to feature Bonkers on the LA police squad sometime after the events of his cartoon, with Miranda Wright as his partner, and many of his friends from the Raw Toonage shorts, though no explanation was given within the show as to why they weren't on their own show anymore. The Miranda Wright character was to act as a sidekick to Bonkers, with their chief, Sergeant Grading, acting as the Eddie Valiant type character, who is opposed to the idea of cartoon characters and humans living side by side, a concept that would prove to not always translate so well into a fully animated program, where it became difficult to tell whether certain characters can be classified as toons or not. The far bigger issue arose though, when Disney ordered the finished drafts for these episodes to be animated at their studios in Japan, as the final product couldn't live up to the high expectations the company set for itself on the TV market. As Weisman recalls, quote, "They saw the first few and panicked. I think the main problem was overseas animation, but there were some art direction issues, a couple of minor voice issues, and some problematic scripts. But mostly, there was an overreaction, allowing problems in animation to tar the entire production. There was a long attempt to work with the current producers, but they were slow to realize the magnitude of the perceived problem. Let me be clear on that. They very rationally reacted to the real problems, which were minor, but didn't get to the extent of the panicked. They underreacted to that and continued to underreact until it got to the point where even I was thinking that we need to make a change because we could not proceed at all the way things stood." At this point, the show was already far into production and ready to air after the Raw Toonage shorts ran their course. Audiences had already been introduced to the Bonkers character with his first short, Pedal to the Metal, and Disney knew they needed the show to air not too long after these shorts, as so to avoid the character fading out of public consciousness. It was Eisner himself who steered production onto its new course and decided to take even closer inspiration from the Spielberg movie, replacing Amanda Wright with Detective Lucky Piquel, giving Bonkers voice actor Jim Cummings 2 roles to play now. This new character was to slowly warm up to toons the same way Eddie Valiant did in Roger Rabbit, while this new dynamic also saw the introduction of new characters like a rabbit of their own called Fall Apart, who was Bonkers' stunt double on their show, Piquel's Chief Knifke was to replace the character of Sergeant Grading, and Piquel's family. This time, a majority of the production would be handled by the now defunct Disney Animation Australia that was most well known for their work on Disney's direct-to-DVD sequels from the 2000s, and as the new format would also provide an explanation for the in-universe Bonkers show's cancellation, it seemed like the far better fit for the character, while practically allowing Disney to have their own weekly Roger Rabbit cartoon without the hassle of needing to license different out-of-studio characters, as Disney had a massive selection of their own properties to choose from that they could then feature as cameo guests on the show. The course seemed to finally be set for Bonkers the Bobcat, but as the initial show was already far into production, it would not have made sense for the company to get rid of the episodes featuring Amanda Wright entirely, ultimately resulting in a Frankenstein's monster of a show that was unlike any of its contemporaries.
Hey, any calls while I was gone?
The first 2 episodes of Bonkers would ultimately premiere as part of the Disney Afternoon on September 3rd, 1993. The aptly titled Going Bonkers acted as an origin story that explained the aftermath of the cancellation of the Bonkers show and showed how Bonkers ended up as the first Toon Cop together with his partner Pikel, as they have to solve the mystery behind a villain known as the Collector. A total of 21 episodes featuring the two would air that month, until on October 4th, 1993, the character of Lucky Pikel was unceremoniously retired and replaced with Amanda Wright. The episode New Partners on the Block sees their cartoonishly incompetent Chief Knifke granting Pikel the promotion he had been waiting for, taking all of Bonkers' other friends from this iteration of the show along with him, and making way for the cast of the show that was in production first to try and provide an explanation for why Pikel and all their other friends were never seen together again. That was, at least, until on November 1st, 1993, the 4th so-called series of the show started airing on the Disney Afternoon that featured the 20 remaining Pikel episodes and only saw short cameos of the characters from the Amanda Wright iteration of the show. While first bridging the gap between Pikel and Amanda's arcs, the latter never saw a send-off of any kind, resulting in an awkward transition from the Amanda Wright-centric batch of episodes to the Series 4 premiere, The Good, the Bad, and the Knifke, that only hints at continuity between these episodes when Chief Knifke gets degraded to the Toon Division and doesn't feature the Amanda Wright character in any fashion, as both iterations of the show were produced by an entirely different staff, as the Amanda Wright and Lucky Pikel episodes were usually aired out of order. But it wasn't any easier for viewers watching the show in chronological order, as there were multiple instances where a reoccurring villain from early in the production cycle was introduced to viewers through a second appearance. While there were few intersections between the Amanda Wright batch of characters and Lucky Pikel's Toon Division. Watching the show also makes it very clear why the Amanda episodes were initially shelved, as the chemistry between Bonkers and his partner is nowhere near as off the wall as the show's intro would lead you to believe. While Lucky is a near exact replica of the Addie Valiant character from Roger Rabbit, with his deadpan delivery yet brisk reactions to the situations he finds himself in, you'd be hard pressed to find any emotion in Miranda's eyes as Bonkers gets haunted by a ghost or Pikel literally dies. The more dialogue heavy structure in the Pikel episodes is emphasized further through harsh color contrast. According to the production notes, while humans are rendered in simple, grayed hues, toons are drawn with bright primaries and no shadow colors, giving them a more two-dimensional look. Toons appear to leap off the screen as their vivid colors contrast with the muted palette of the humans. What this explanation doesn't excuse, however, is the abundance of animation errors, especially during the Miranda Wright episodes, where coloring mistakes, layering slips, and characters popping in and out of frame show how much crunch time was had behind the scenes. So while it is debatable whether the show intentionally featured washed out colors, it is much more apparent during the Lucky Pikel series of episodes and serves to add to its atmosphere. Where the Lucky episodes are more concerned with actually trying to solve mysteries and relies a lot on the character of Pikel, Miranda's are much closer to the raw Toonage shorts in their delivery and feature a wider selection of zany cartoon characters. These would sometimes include the odd cameo of some of Disney's more noteworthy figures such as Dumbo, Donald, and Mickey, but admittedly less than you would expect from a show of its kind. Mickey, for instance, was only ever name-dropped in one episode before prominently being featured in Season 3's I Oughta Be in Toons, where Pikel and Bonkers need to find out the real identity of an imposter posing as the mouse, as Mickey himself is never referred to by name and can only be seen in silhouette throughout the entire episode. Bonkers himself would also only rarely ever make appearances in other Disney media, as the reputation it had garnered through the rocky production and subpar Miranda Wright episodes quickly turned it into a laughingstock among the animation community. One famous instance of this was the Warner Brothers cartoon Animaniacs that aired around the same time that took a few not so subtle jabs at their rival on the Disney Afternoon.
We don't need the time, just this stuff. A happy postal worker. Edible fruitcake. A funny episode of Bonkers.
Despite their best efforts trying to stitch together two entirely different versions of the same show, it could not mask the glaring flaws with each, as Bonkers' voice gets quite grating to listen to after a while, and the show never made full use of its premise in either iteration. One of the more glaring instances of this took place during the episode Seems Like Old Tunes, where Pickell and Bonkers get tasked with saving a fledgling local animation studio from being demolished if it can't deliver their animation in time. As it turns out, Lucky's daughter Marilyn is quite adept at the medium and agrees to help them out by animating these animated characters and drawing a cartoon in the middle of a cartoon that in return turns into a cartoon drawn by a real-life human within a cartoon. The episode unfortunately never takes any proper measures to explain this predicament, making the distinction between cartoons and humans in the world of Bonkers even harder to pin down. But even those who could look past all these flaws eventually had a hard pill to swallow when on April 19th, 1995, the episode New Partners on the Block was removed from circulation, thereby denying fans the opportunity to see how Pickell got promoted away from the Toon division and Miranda Wright became Bonkers' new partner. Much like the 17th episode Fall Apart Bomb Squad, this was done as a result of the Oklahoma City bombings where 168 people were killed during a terrorist attack. As both these episodes featured antagonists of the week relating to explosives, it was deemed necessary to stop airing the two. And after the final episode had aired in February '94, Disney quickly took the wind out of Bonkers' sails. A show that was plagued with an odd production cycle and conflicting premises that always felt the need to punch up to something bigger than itself, quickly faded into obscurity. Bonkers would be seen making the odd appearance at Disney parks between 1993 and 96 and would be a regular at Disneyland Paris until 2000, but hadn't received any full release on VHS or DVD, and as the show only aired on Toon Disney until late 2004, for many years there was no way of viewing many of the original Bonkers episodes, with even the first short Pedal to the Metal only being available in foreign languages. There were even a few unmade Bonkers episodes. Indiana Bonkers and the Temple of Fawn would have seen the spirit of an ancient Egyptian princess task Bonkers with finding a stolen radio, and Plaid Toon was another attempt to impress his love interest Fawn Deer that finds Bonkers enlisting in the army. Despite popular belief, however, all the Miranda Wright episodes Disney complained about were eventually finished and added to the lineup, making this the only Bonkers content that may forever be lost to time. Despite the rather interesting backstory behind the show, as Bonkers never enjoyed the same level of adoration as its contemporaries when it first aired, there were few fans actually looking forward to its return on Disney+. The odd ironic tweet aside, the inclusion of Bonkers on the streaming service was a baffling decision more than anything else, as the show isn't much more than a product of its time that desperately tried to imitate a lightning in a bottle that simply wouldn't work with even the slightest of changes to the formula. And it only complicated things further when said formula was tampered with multiple times, making it difficult for the audience to get attached to this cast. For as colorful as they are, the circumstances surrounding the show simply made it too much of a mess to properly get invested in at the time. The show simply became too bonkers for its own good. Hey folks, thanks for sticking around to the end. I want to give a very special shout out to the What a Cartoon podcast for their episode on the subject. They were the ones who even inspired me to work on this video in the first place. If you want to hear even more about Bonkers, I encourage you to seek out their episode on I Oughta Be in Tunes. It's free to download on all podcast apps and they deserve all the support in the world. I really can't believe how much there is to talk about with this dumb kids cartoon from the 90s. I really had to stop myself before potentially diving into an even deeper rabbit hole with conspiracy theories about why Roger Rabbit 2 was cancelled, the decline of the Disney afternoon, but we would have just gotten way off topic. I wanted to have this video out a few days ago already, but there actually was an internet outage in my apartment that's still going on as I'm writing this, and I would have contacted my provider about it if I still had my login credentials, which I can't find, so I'm stuck at a cafe like an idiot. Don't be like me. Use NordPass, the new password manager from NordVPN that autosaves and autofills all necessary information on every site you frequent so that you never have to remember the password yourself ever again. The same also applies for credit cards. with optional two-factor authentication, a password generator, and a phishing scanner that recognizes suspicious sites so you don't get tricked into revealing your information. It is the most user-friendly method to store any kind of login credentials onto any of your devices. Their award-winning 24/7 customer support will also help you with any further questions like, how much does this great service cost? Well, that I can tell you. If you go to my link at nordpass.com/Cosmodor and use the code Cosmodor, you will get 50% off your NordPass subscription for only $2.50 a month. And you also get an additional month on top completely free of charge. That's nordpass.com/Cosmodor with the code Cosmodor.
I've always wanted to be a TV cop. But do you really think anyone would watch?